0.5 live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. First of all, a sincere apologies from us. We've had some technical differences. We've got difficulties. We've got people in 4 different time zones. We've got people sitting in train stations, all sorts of things. So thank you very much for your patience, and we hopefully will get to the questions that people have posted. What I'd like to do before we start is just to talk quickly about the process. So I'll get our different presenters to introduce themselves. Then we'll have some open discussion. So if people want to post some open questions, we will also deal with the questions that have already been posted. And then we'll get to some of the questions that were emailed to us prior to this Hangout. So if I can just ask, I'll start with you, Yuko, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, just a short introduction in your experience with resilience.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm Yuko Kurauchi. I'm the policy specialist working at UNDP Global Policy Center on resilient ecosystems and desertification. And as UNDP, our center has been supporting, especially in African countries, to undertake highly qualitative assessment tool at the community and then household level. And this is an attempt for us to fill in the gap where the actually affected people whose resilience has been tested every day do not necessarily have the voice to influence policy decisions or programmatic decisions on what is the best approach to tackle the issue of vulnerability or resilience building. So our approach is to work with the country offices and then the counterpart, the government, NGO, UN, and then other community organizations to visit the communities on site and then obtain the inputs and then comments from the ground, utilizing the methodology called community-based resilience analysis, or COBRA. And maybe after this session, I would like to send out or request the organizer to send the link to the practical implementation guidelines that we developed to implement this COBRA approach. Is it sufficient at this point for introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Yuko. That's great. Next, we'll go to Million Belay in Sweden.
Yeah, my name is Million Belay. I'm an Ethiopian. I work as a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center. I'm also the coordinator of one of the biggest alliance in Africa, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. In terms of resilience, I do research in Ethiopia on an issue on changing food systems. So I use participatory mapping for doing resilience analysis. We do map of the past, we do map of the present, we compare the two, the past and the present, and we do scenario analysis with local actors, mainly local communities, local government, and those others working at the local community side. And I was participating at a resilience assessment methodology called RAPTA, and also I did my own resilience assessment with communities in Africa, and more especially in Ethiopia.
Great, thanks, Million. Ellison, to you in Canada.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Alison Quinlan. I am a senior research fellow with the Resilience Alliance. As Paul said, I'm based in Ottawa, Canada. And I've been working in this area of resilience research with the Resilience Alliance for the last couple of decades, and was involved in the early work on developing a process for resilience assessment with the Social Ecological Systems Workbook for Practitioners in 2007 and then updated in 2010. And more recently, I'm working with a team at the Stockholm Resilience Center as part of the GRADE program to develop an updated approach to resilience assessment and practice. And yeah, and I've had the opportunity to be involved in running resilience assessments in different places in the world, both at sort of a rural community level, coastal communities, and even desktop applications in the Arctic. So a number of large watersheds in the United States. So quite a diverse range of cases in which I've been involved in applying this approach to. Thanks, Paul.
Great, thanks, Alison. And my name's Paul Ryan. I'm a resilience practitioner based part-time at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, working with Allyson on the GRADE program, which is looking at developing new approaches to development, particularly focused on a resilience perspective or a complexity perspective. And the other half of my time, I run a company in Australia that does resilience assessments, and like Allyson, have done lots of various resilience assessments in different places all around the place in different areas. So what we thought we'd do is move to some of the questions that have come in first. So I've got a number of questions here. I'll try to get through as many as we can, and what I'll try to do is to direct them to different members of our presentation team. And I might start, Allyson, I've got one here that I think is probably a good question for you, which is, could we elaborate on the difference between adaptation and transformation? You've emphasised a lot on how transformation is gravely needed in the Anthropocene, and how to try to make it happen. Does that mean that transformation is always the optimal or ultimate choice? Is there a case when adaptation would be a better choice? That's from Arne. Do you want to have a go at that one, Allyson?
Sure, thanks, Paul. It's a really good question. Obviously, I think, Carl Folke has written about how the resilience really includes adaptation and transformation. So I like to think about these concepts as being quite closely related and actually almost along a continuum. Original ideas around resilience were focused on persisting, keeping the system in its current state so that it's able to continue to supply valued ecosystem services. The sort of food and fresh water and regulating services, quality of air, that sort of thing, to a system, an area, whether that's a geographic place, a community, a village, etc. And then kind of moving across that continuum from persistence and simply kind of maintaining that state to adapting, because there's constantly a need to adapt. There's new challenges. This is part of the world we live in, and it's also part of the natural environment to evolve. And so there's always a need for adaptation, making adjustments and improvements, and responding essentially so that the system can still continue to provide those ecosystem services that are valued. And I think for me, the question about when to adapt and when to transform is, and there's been some writing about this, if for example, the distribution of those ecosystem services is not equitable, if some people are benefiting and others are not benefiting, well, then there may be a need to fundamentally change the system. An adaptation might not be enough to ensure that there's equitable distribution, or that the system is actually sustainable over the long term. It could be sustainable over the short term, but if it's not sustainable over the long term, then you may need to reconfigure the system. And I mean, that makes it sound a lot simpler than it actually is, obviously. But there needs to be some consideration about fundamentally changing the system from perhaps an irrigation agricultural system in parts of Australia to something that's maybe more tourism based, changing the economy and the key components of that system so that it's more sustainable and that the distribution of benefits is more equitable. And so I think for me, you adapt when when it's a safe and just operating space that you're working within, and you continually need to adapt. But if you don't have that, then you have to consider transformation.
Thanks, Alison. And related to that is another question, which is are we talking about transformation or adaptation being the end game? What's the state that we're aiming for, or are we always continually having to flip between adaptation and transformation? Yuko, do you want to reflect on that?
Thank you very much. Just to share our experiences in Africa, we undertook this COBRA assessment, going to the communities and then talking with the representative community members, as well as so-called identified resilient household. Those are the people who are identified by the community themselves, that they better dealt with or coped with the past shocks and stresses. You name what, the kind of shocks and stresses. There are various different types depending on the context. So we are combining the results from the overall affected communities as well as those reconsidered as better situations already individually or as a household to respond to those shocks. And then our findings, well, like I cannot generalize, but from the experience of 5-6 countries are that more resilient household, especially in rural areas, they are well, looking towards transformation, mainly because they are already seeing the benefits of that kind of lifestyle. So many of the communities we are visiting are traditional agro-based communities. And then those who have never been exposed to non-farm-based or livelihood tend to look at the more traditional ways. And then when they are receiving regularly those humanitarian support or cash or goods-based support from external sources, they tend to look at and then tend to rely on those supports. Meanwhile, those who are coping with the past disasters or shocks or stresses for more long term without any support, and when they are managing more, then they talk about their experience that way, such as going into the business, small business, or even migrating and then changing their locations and then their lives completely, or even like having better education for the kids so that they have wider range of opportunities in the future beyond the agro-based livelihood. So that's the kind of like findings that we encountered so far. Thank you.
And of course, we know that complex systems are never static. They're never stable. They have periods of relative stability, but they're never actually in a set state or a fixed state where you'd get to a place where you'd say, well, this is sustainable or this is a transformed system, and so now it will be like this. We can all relax. It will continue to provide the benefits and goods and services that we want from this system. There'll be some type of shock, or there's always drivers and different types of drivers coming and going at different times and acting in different ways on a system. And so the types of social ecological systems that we all work in are never static for very long. So I guess from my perspective, thinking about that flip from adaptation to transformation and the balance between those two things is, as Alison mentioned, there's times when you might want to keep a system within a particular operating space, so you're working to keep it there. But inevitably, the drivers, the things that are acting on that system, are pushing on that system, will change over time. There'll be changes in things like markets or economic development or conflict in a nearby country or whatever it might be that creates changes in that country. And so then you might find yourself faced with needing to think about transformation. So I think we shouldn't try to think about adaptation and transformation as either or. There's a constant interplay between those, and of course this is happening at different scales as well. So, okay. Million, I was wondering if I could come to you, and we've got a question here, quite a specific question, but could you consider corruption as a motive for resilience thinking or a retarding element? why? So thinking about something like corruption how would you think about that from a resilience perspective, and whether it's something that restricts or retards a system from development?
I think to give a particular and a specific example about the previous question, transformation in adaptation. There is this community, for example, in the center of Ethiopia. It's an agricultural community. They have a very good soil, but their soil is eroding quite fast, and they have their own seeds, higher diversity of seeds, like 19 varieties of barley. Now they're losing the 14 varieties, and they're left with 5 varieties. There's wheat diversity is decreasing. They had a patch of forest, and that's also disappearing, But the system is going through very bad change. So in terms of adaptation, for me, it would be to implement soil and water conservation and plantation of trees to increase the forest biomass, and also introducing the agroecological kinds of farming techniques. So kind of tinkering through the system. But if that system, if that the whole agricultural land or the whole community have left that land, and if the land degrades, it changes to stony land, then probably it's closer to Addis Ababa, and probably having a factory around that area would be an option. Then that's a complete transformation, or from an agroecological kind of farming into agrochemical based, GM based, or variety. Improved variety based agriculture, where the knowledge of farmers is completely changed by the new system, is what transformation is for me. In terms of corruption, I think corruption is a systemic problem. You're taking a vital part of the system out of the system through a limited number of individuals, and it would increase poverty in the country because money is not circulating in the economy and people are not getting money. It will create a social upheaval at the end of the day, because people will revolt because of that revolt, and change would come. So corruption is a huge problem wherever it exists, because it would create. Yes.
Can I ask, Million, do you see a distinction between the sort of, low-level corruption, the day-to-day corruption that, people might do at a household level, for example, a government official or whatever it might be, that is involved in corruption more to sustain their own livelihoods and for their family, etc. The difference between that and sort of organised corruption on a kind of government scale where money goes out of the country. So is one, could you see one as a way of helping a system to sort of function and people to survive in that system at one level, but, at that sort of more organised or high-level corruption where money goes out of the country, like you say, sapping vital resources, and particularly if those resources are, being taken away from people who need them more in other parts of the system. Do you see a distinction in that, or do you just think corruption as a concept, because it undermines trust in governance, it undermines trust in good process, etc.? Is it just bad in all cases?
You see, it's a question of value. You see, small corruptions grow up into a bigger corruption. There was a very interesting analysis also in Ethiopia. Some people were saying that during the previous regime, the regime that we had 27 years ago, soldiers used to go to houses and take sons and daughters and kill them. And this environment, then mothers and fathers used to give money to the soldiers to corrupt them so that they let their children live. And sometimes when you go to an institution, if the institution is not functioning for your own purpose, individual purpose, when you give it some money, then things run. But these things will grow up. If these people have power at the end of the day, then they would want more money out of the people. You see? So what is happening at the small scale level is highly connected to the value of the people at the higher scale level. It's very much connected. So it's dangerous. It's a cancer where it exists. And the local officials who are used to taking a little bit of money from the people, if there is an implement coming to the local community, then they will take it and sell it. And education will be severely damaged in the local community level, and other infrastructure will be harmed because people value corruption as a value.
Yes.
So wherever it exists, it's really bad.
Yes. Thanks, Million. Yuko, I've got a question here. Is it possible to establish resilient thinking strategies without the involvement of government? So in other words, can communities self-organise and establish resilient thinking strategies or resilience-based strategies? What's your perspective on that?
Our experience from the ground is that the term resilience is such a technical made-up term, which is not necessarily understood well. However, on daily life, they are facing and then responding to different challenges or changes on the ground, and then that is applied at our personal level, and then therefore some of the aspects are already embedded into our personal life. But when it comes to more systematic or strategic direction setting at the policy-wide level or multi-community level, yes, it is considered as relevant to have such mechanism or strategy to implement resilience on the ground or assess resilience at different levels. How many to have, or do we have only one, a common one in the world? That is to be seen. And then resilience currently is also, to some extent, conducted on an experimental basis. And then different approaches are applied in different contexts. We are working as UNDP very, very much deeply in African region, and then now the question is coming whether the approach that we had in Africa can be also translated, same approach, in Middle Eastern countries or Asia, which is slightly more developed in terms of the development pathway. So those questions are depending on the context, and then also we have to ask if we are requiring the assessment, the resilience assessment approach, because in some countries the more traditional approach, such as vulnerability assessment, which worked completely fine, and then therefore they don't require any further intervention, while other areas are having series of recurrent same issues, facing the similar types of challenges and then shocks and stresses, and then in those contexts the intervention through more strategic approach will be required. But it's very difficult to mention what will work where. And then also we have to also understand how the different approaches will inform to each other, because one works in every single context may not exist.
Yeah, no, of course, every context is different. And just from my perspective, I would say that, yes, of course, resilience strategies can be developed without government intervention or without government support. It's important to recognise, I think, the different type of approaches that a sort of top-down government approach, or even where government's not trying to be too top-down, but a government-supported process is a very different process to one that's run by the community. So, for example, governments tend to think in sort of shorter timeframes because, you know, they're working on a political time cycle, they're working on budget time cycles, etc. Whereas communities tend to not think in that same kind of time frame. They're thinking about long term. They've been there in that community or in that landscape for a long period of time. And so even just getting people thinking about those different time scales, when you work with government, it tends to drive you to think about projects, and the world is kind of projectified and divided into these individual projects and interventions. When you work with community, it tends to be about long-term issues and about slowly building social capital and trust and, you know, building those connections between people and building understanding and learning from the past, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's important when people are thinking about working with communities to think carefully about what the organisation or the structure, the institution that holds the kind of resilience thinking process, what that means and what that brings to the whole dynamic. Does it mean that because you're a government agency, different people will come and be part of the process with you, compared with if you're an NGO, compared with if you're just a community group that's self-organising from within the community? So there's differences, there's certainly differences in the way those different institutions think about resilience and implement resilience, and it matters to the type of process that you might run. I've got a few other questions. I'll try to, we've only got about 10 minutes left. I'll try to get through as many as I can, but so a question here is that many resilience projects are happening in developing countries. Is that because communities there are more open and welcoming to resilience and adaptation and transformation? So Million, just your perspective on that. Is it the focus on resilience in developing countries? Is it because people there are open to change, do you think?
It's a very interesting question. I lived in Ethiopia, and I work at the continental level, and also I lived for the past a year and about 9 months here in Sweden. You know, at every scale in every continent, everybody has an issue. They have an issue, but most of the development funding is available for developing countries, and that's what is being written about. For example, I'm going to Brussels today to participate in a big meeting on developing a food system law at the European Union level, and I was reading the documents which was produced by over 150 civil society organizations, and their assessment of the food system, the resilience of the food system in Europe is quite astounding, you know. So they are saying that's not going in the right direction, either environmentally, health-wise, human rights-wise, and culture-wise. So challenges are everywhere. Every part of the continent needs to work on resilience issue. And I think there are also a lot of publications on resilience issues in other continents also. I think the resilience science has developed due to the research done in Australia and also in Sweden. Yes, local communities in developing countries are very much open to researchers, you know, and also most of the time, for good or for bad, they are framed as vulnerable. You know, resilience is very much related to connected to vulnerability. So when you talk about vulnerability, most of the time, what comes to your mind is a vulnerability of communities in developing countries. Maybe that's where the association comes in. Otherwise, the science works for, I think, almost everywhere. Yep.
Paul, are you there? I think we've lost Paul. While we're waiting, Allyson, can you maybe talk about sort of a couple of examples of where sort of you're starting to use resilience assessment in a different way? And, you know, if you're really trying to talk to development practitioners who are thinking about using Wayfinder in the future, why is this approach like really got value as opposed to what's come before? It would be really great if you could jump in.
Sure, Andrew. Okay, so Andrew mentioned Wayfinder, and Wayfinder is building on established resilience assessment methods and approaches, again, kind of coming out of the Resilience Alliance tradition and the workbook for practitioners, but also updated with several key insights that were identified and just work both theoretical research, but also importantly, practical experience of practitioners working in various places around the world over the past 10 to 15 years. And so bringing all of this knowledge together and trying to inform an update to how we go about doing resilience assessment. And so for example, I guess in right now in Senegal, there's a team working in a rural villages, a couple of rural villages, applying Wayfinder as a pilot approach, a pilot project, sorry. And one of the interesting sort of learnings that came out of that, and there's more forthcoming, has been the importance of really taking the time necessary to build a coalition, as we call it. So when you're first beginning with the resilience assessment process, and in this case applying Wayfinder, something that we put a lot of emphasis on was providing sufficient time and focus on bringing together a team of people who are stakeholders, who are committed for the long term, who really have the capacity to make change happen in that system through the institutions that they're connected with, and their own capacities, and to really work collaboratively together as a team. And then when they're holding workshops at the rural level or among their coalition team, to emphasize how these can bring together quite a diverse range of participants. Again, in the case in Senegal, it was important to hold different workshops. So with women's group, with the pastoralists group, with small business managers, etc. first, so that diversity could come through before those groups came together and developed more of a shared understanding of the system dynamics. First, it was important to work in these separate workshops. And so again, that's just a small example. The first phase of 5 phases of the Wayfinder process is building this coalition. And what we're seeing is that so far is really paying off in terms of the time investment, I guess I would say the commitment really to seeing the process through and really fully engaging in some of the activities that come later on, some of the sort of more technical aspects of the assessment. And I see that we have Paul back now, so I'll pass the microphone over to Paul. Thanks. And see if you'd like to pick up.
Thanks, Ellison. Sorry about that, some more technical difficulties. So we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, but what I'm hoping is that if Allyson and Million and Yuko can stay on the line a bit longer, we'll try to catch up some of those questions that people asked and make up for that time that we lost. So just if we can, just for another 10 minutes or so. So a couple of questions. One around at what stage can we transform? So someone's asking at what stage in the process or what stage in the development of a social ecological system can we transform? Because I think at that stage we're ready to move on, but also lose what's threatened. So I guess the question is really around the fact that once we make a decision to transform and move away from a particular way of operating in a system, we're going to lose some things as well as gaining. We will gain when we move to a new configuration or a new way of doing things. We're also going to lose some things that we might have been hanging on to in that system. Yuko, do you want to talk about that, about letting go? At what point do you sort of abandon the current system if it's dysfunctional or you need to transform? But when you do that, you're also going to let go of a lot of things, and there's going to be a lot of loss as you try to transform to a new system.
Thank you very much. Well, again, the experience on when and then how is again, depending on the context. But whenever we go to the assessment in the field, already the field or that location has some sort of problem. And then they have the need to change. And then therefore we are requested to provide support in assessing the situation and also recommending. But they tend to come up with various different, like too diverse set of recommendations sometimes. The community's aspiration may be really good when they hear about the resilience concept. They're really like motivated, and then they would like to try something new and then something very, very innovative, which is great. But we also have to have the trade-off on which area to prioritize, considering the time limit, financial limit, technical limit, or different sorts of the spectrum. And then that balancing is the decision to be made. Mostly the government who are managing the situation, if we are talking about the specific administrative locations. And then therefore our recommendation is to engage those government agencies from the beginning, because they are the ones to buy in different ideas or different aspirations, and then translate them into practices in many cases, especially at the policy policy arena. And then also, other NGO community organizations, they are there to support the local level effort. And then there should be the combination of big scale intervention as well as small scale interventions. The problem which we the experience, especially in the Horn of Africa region, which has been facing recurrent drought issue, was that many agencies receive small amount short-term funding from the donors to find a quick fix. But in some cases, the underlying challenge was related, for example, with long-term insecurity or long-term gender inequality. And then therefore, some of the agencies, such as ministry related to gender or peace and security, as well as all these, like usual suspect type of agencies such as agriculture, have to come in, and water, so that they will come up with the joint approach. And then that's we have to see if it is success. But that's what the Horn of Africa region came up through so-called Idrisi initiative, which is the multi-year, multi-decades initiative to enhance drought resilience in the region, supported by or participated by IGAD member states. And then those countries came up with the different the sectoral components to work together. Not only one agency to be responsible, but the different ministries, agencies coming together to jointly look at the way forward. So that's one experience I'd like to share.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Yuko. We've also got a question here about quite a specific question about groundwater and over exploitation of groundwater resources from wells and boreholes, mostly in urban areas, due to little or no government sustainability initiatives. And just a question about how would a socio-ecological approach address that issue. And I guess I can just talk from my own experience working with farmers in lots of different areas. And groundwater is a really challenging problem because of the simple fact that you can't see it. So when we deplete surface water, it's obvious, the impacts are obvious, dams dry up, streams dry up as we divert water for agriculture. But when you're talking about groundwater, because it's essentially an unseen resource until it's pumped out of the ground, people don't often understand how rapidly they're depleting a resource, and it's really easy to go over a tipping point. And we know that groundwater is one of those things that does have a tipping point in it. Some aquifer systems, for example, collapse once they're over pumped. So once the water's extracted, the sediment or the aggregates in the groundwater system can compact down, and sometimes they can't refill. And so it's a type of threshold or a tipping point that once you cross, you sometimes can't go back from. So it's a real challenge to think from a resilience perspective about that. And some of the things we've tried to do working with farmers on groundwater systems is to understand who's in the system. and that can be really difficult. It actually involves mapping the groundwater, and we often have poor information about the groundwater systems. But the first thing is to try to find out who's part of this social ecological system. And so if you can map the groundwater and then map who extracts water from that groundwater system, and then who benefits from that water. So where does that water flow to, and who are the beneficiaries of that surface water, whether that's from irrigation or whether it's from drinking water, or whether it's used in terms of flows to ecosystems. So understanding and mapping all of those components, who's part of the system. And then we try to get a shared understanding or an understanding of the aspirations of those people, and to say, well, if you want to continue to access this groundwater, if you want to continue to benefit from it, we need to work out how we jointly will share the resource. And so bringing people together and trying to get some common understanding of the aspirations that people have, and building their awareness of the fact that the aquifer is a limited resource. Generally they recharge very slowly, often over very long timescales, decades to even longer. And so trying to work out how to match the human timescales to the ecological or the groundwater system timescales, so that people can start to see that we need to think about ways to bring those things more into alignment. And then if it requires the development of a new governance structure, so maybe a new group or a new committee that oversees the use of groundwater, and that might include developing the rules and the way that water will be shared out together, so that the community themselves discuss that and come up with options for how water can be shared and the types of rules that might need to be put in place over time. And that might also include things like the sanctions or the penalties for if people don't follow the rules. And so they might be as simple as things like social exclusion, or it might be that right through to sort of formal penalties where people can be excluded from accessing groundwater, or maybe even financially penalised, or whatever it might be. And then a really key part with groundwater systems is to establish that feedback, because it's a system that's out of sight. Actually being able to develop the ways that people can get feedback about the state of the groundwater. So working out how to monitor bores and getting the community involved in monitoring the level of water in bores, and reporting on that in some way and feeding that back, and sharing that information, so that people can start to develop their own understandings about how the system works, about how quickly the system recharges, about how quickly it gets extracted, etc., etc. And all of that is sort of underpinned by this kind of learning approach, which is essentially trying to say we have to learn how to stay within the limits of this system, and that learning needs to occur over the range of conditions that might be experienced for that system. So it's one thing to measure the groundwater depth and its use when there's plenty of rainfall and the system's being recharged, but when it comes to drought and people are using more and more water, extracting more and more water, and the system's not recharging very quickly or as quickly, then we need to know that. We need to understand how that system functions under a range of different conditions over time. And so building a kind of learning approach. But again, I would stress that need for the people in the system to be involved in understanding the system, to be involved in developing the rules of the system and how water will be shared, etc. And even if that has to be done with government direction, but nevertheless engaging the people in the system to be heavily involved. I'll move on to just the last few questions that we might have time to get to. So one is a question around, from our experience, can we give examples where resilience has had negative impacts on communities, or negative results from either deploying resilience or a system being resilient in a negative way? Alison, do you want to talk about that? The idea of resilience can have negative implications for a system as well?
Just before we jump in there, I just wanted to say that Million actually needs to catch his flight to Brussels about the European food system. So maybe he could make a final reflection, and then he can leave us, and then the others can.
Okay, thanks, Million.
But thanks, guys.
You need to unmute, Million.
Thank you very much. I want to say two or three things. Probably I have a perfect example for a negative resilience, which is basically my own government. They're very good in keeping themselves there, but in terms of the right direction in social and ecological transformation, they're really making the political situation untenable. They're improving now in the last 2 months, but a government can be negatively resilient in a very bad government. But in general, what I wanted to say is in working on resilience and resilience assessment, I think it's my experience that it's very, very much important that we look to the past. What was that community 50, 60, 40 years ago? What was the biocultural diversity of that community? Or in a Stockholm Resilience Center term, so the social ecological resilience of that community. So what is that? We have to really understand the present. So it's very much important we mobilize knowledge in the history, the social ecological history of the past, so that we understand the present and also we understand the future. So that's my reflection. In most of the resilience assessments and resilience discussions, I don't find that, especially when we are talking about context-specific resilience assessment or resilience approach, especially the continent that I know in Africa. I think we need to do that. That's the only thing that I want to say.
Great. Thank you, Million. Thank
you so much. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. And to all the listeners, thank you very much for making the time to be with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Million. Safe flight. Safe travels.
Bye-bye.
Alison, do you want to reflect on that about negative resilience, about when resilience can have a negative impact?
Yeah, sure. I think Million did a great job, and I guess two things come to mind for me. And it's not so much, I guess, that resilience has a negative impact. I see resilience as being sort of a property of the system, and the system either has more or less resilience. And again, like the system itself, it's never static, it's sort of in flux. But what comes to mind in speaking about this idea of negative resilience is maybe more the notion of traps, and that a system can become, it's the sort of old idea of when you get stuck in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. Don't make the situation worse than it already is, and that by perpetuating the same sort of processes and ways of governing the system and things that are being done, just kind of maintains the position of that system in a trap. And so there's been some really great examples that Jamila Haider and others at the Stockholm Resilience Center have written about, particularly in less developed countries, this notion that you can kind of have a bit of a slippery slope into these traps, and it makes transformation that much more difficult. The sort of step between both getting out of that trap and transforming, and the need to take that time to prepare for transformation, to sort of build the capacity in the agency and time your activities and interventions so that you have the right opportunity and you're able to seize on those windows of opportunity to start to emerge from that trap. So I guess I tend to think of traps first when I hear about negative resilience. And then the other thing is, I guess, in terms of resilience assessment processes, if there's negative outcomes, that makes me think more in terms of, how the process was done, and if a certain sort of minimum requirements were met in the with the approach. And so I know we've had some discussions in our team, our grade team, working on Wayfinder around what are the core components that you really can't overlook and leave out in a resilience assessment process. And Yuko also mentioned the need for, the really much longer timescales and for investing in resilience and for investing in transformation. It's not something that can be done on weeks or month-long scales, and we are probably in most cases talking about decades. And that that commitment to the long-term effort required. And so, when has resilience failed? I mean, I would say resilience approaches are generally learning processes. You're setting up a process to bring people together, to collaborate, to share knowledge, to learn together about the system dynamics. And so if it's done well, I think that it's not so much that you can blame the process, but perhaps if certain critical things have been left out, like as Million referred to, really engaging with and understanding the historical dynamics of the system, why it is the way it is at a given point in time, the sort of decisions that had been made in the past that set it on a path, and how you might redirect that development pathway requires that you understand those historical dynamics. And so, those are the two things I think about in terms of putting together the words resilience and failure. It's really traps, or it's have you really met the requirements of the resilience assessment approach or resilience planning approach.
Thanks, Alison. So we're going to wrap up, but just one last comment from Yuko. I'm just interested in how can we improve resilience practice? How can we improve the practice the way we all use different approaches to resilience, but still around this common theme? How can we improve resilience practice?
Thank you. My last comment to the group or audience is that the resilience assessment and implementation, as well as the policy change, those processes are, the not one-off thing and then continuous. And then people tend to find the easy way out, putting, for example, in a proposal, this way, this project will contribute to the resilience building, without thinking how really that will be measured. And then therefore, once the resilience assessment is undertaken, and then very useful recommendations are coming out, and then priority interventions at different levels may be implemented. But how these will change the system, or at community level or above, like that kind of M&E system have to be really in place. Otherwise, we are doing it, but we cannot justify or prove that we are doing the right thing. And for doing that, we have to understand that communities do not necessarily face changes only once. They tend to have the cycle of facing different shocks and stresses, especially in the rural communities, which are considered as poor. And then they have similar the disasters, maybe at a different degree, but the hurricanes, earthquakes, the drought, flood, conflict, they may come in and out. And then there are good examples that we can learn from the past. And then there must be some already data existing on who coped with those better and then who are not. And then we can sample out some of those data from different the group of people, and then continuously monitor how different interventions will support these different groups to cope with the future, incoming changes and disasters. There are cases that we can do. Or at other areas, maybe it's one-off and it's very difficult. But what I would like to say is that it's not the one-off process, and then continuous process will require good monitoring and then follow-up process at different levels. And then thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Paul for your great facilitation, and then the people who participated in this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yuko. Alison, do you want to have one final comment, and then we'll close, just about how do we improve resilience practice? What can we do to improve practice on the ground?
Sure. I mean, I would really like to echo Yuko's comments, because I think she is exactly spot on, which is that, this is similar to there not being an end point in terms of you transform the system and ta-da, you're there, or you adapt and you're there. Everything's always in flux, and we're always working at improving how we do resilience assessment, and we're, it's more probably appropriately thought of as, just really a way of doing things, and you engage in the process at different points in time. But if you're working and managing a system like with that resilience mindset, then you come back to it, and you have new strategies for intervening the system, and that's always adapting. And so, as Yuko said, this is an ongoing way of thinking about system dynamics, of managing the system, bringing people together, and really working together for these more sustainable, equitable systems.
Great. Thanks, Ellison.
Thanks, Paul.
So we'll draw that to a close now. Thanks to our presenters, to Allyson, to Yuko, and to Million. And thank you to all the participants for your great questions. Lots of really interesting questions, and they're still coming in. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to deal with them all, but thank you for those really interesting and challenging questions. And what I hope is that you've got some insights into thinking about resilience practice from some really very experienced resilience practitioners on the ground who've done a lot of work with this. And I guess we look forward to your ongoing participation in the MOOC and in other Hangouts. So thanks for participating, and we'll sign off. Thank you.